Okay, so you should all have a text of Mark 7 translated into Russian. Now, I can't read it in Russian, but I do know one thing, that in Russian, just like in English, the number after 15 and before 17 is 16, right? Is that correct? And if you'll look here, you'll see we have verse 14, then we have verse 15, and then we have 17. This is not only in Russian Bibles. This is in English Bibles, and it's actually in most editions of the Greek now as well. So the question is, what happened to verse 16? It's not an accident that it was taken out. It appears in many ancient manuscripts, and it's not an accident that it was taken out. It's part of a, I don't know if I should say this in Moscow, this word, but it's part of a conspiracy. And the conspiratia is to change the meaning of the Gospel of Mark from head to foot, to turn it upside down. Because according to almost everyone, according to all Christian thinkers and writers, Mark 7, chapter 7 of the Gospel of Mark, is the place where Jesus clearly indicated that the Torah is no longer valid and that it is okay now to eat shinken and everything. I'm going to try to explain that, because according to my view, it is the exact opposite. The original meaning of this text is the exact opposite from the way it is usually understood. And not only is Jesus not denying the Torah, not denying the applicability of Jewish law, and especially in this case of Kashrut, but he is actually upholding them completely. So the story begins when some Pharisees who come from Jerusalem see that Jesus' disciples are not washing their hands before they are eating. And they say to Jesus, they complain to Jesus, and they say, how come your disciples are not washing their hands? At this point, Jesus gets angry. Now, this is the crux. This is the important point on which this whole story turns. Why did Jesus get angry? Why did he start attacking the Pharisees? According to the usual story, he attacked the Pharisees because they had this terrible commitment to these details of the Torah, these laws of the Torah, which are only external things and have no spiritual significance. But in order to interpret that way, and I emphasize again, this is the way everyone interprets, nearly everyone, for 2,000 years. In order to interpret that way, you actually have to ignore the continuation of the text. If you look in, I think it's in verses 8 and the immediate continuation, you'll see that Jesus first goes off on what seems to be a complete tangent. He starts complaining about two things. One thing he says is that the Pharisees ignore the Torah, or they change the Torah, they set the Torah aside in the name of their traditions, the traditions of their ancestors. Now, why would Jesus say that if what he was about to do was to say that the Torah is invalid? In other words, why would he accuse the Pharisees of setting aside the Torah, and then, according to the usual interpretation, 5 verses later say the whole Torah is invalid? This would be, at the very least, an argument in extreme bad faith. So let's take seriously for the moment the idea, just at least for the moment, just we'll stipulate that when Jesus complains that the Pharisees are ignoring the Torah, that he means this. Considering that possibility in our minds, we move on a little bit in the story. The first thing Jesus says, that he cites a verse from Isaiah, from the prophet Isaiah, and he complains that the Pharisees are actually fulfilling that verse. Namely, the verse in Isaiah accuses Israel, or some people in Israel, of setting aside what God said in the name of human doctrines. The implication of what he is saying is that the Pharisees, by preferring their own oral law, what we call the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition, which they call the Masorat Avot, the tradition of the fathers, that they are substituting human words, namely the traditions of the fathers, in place of what is written in the Torah. And then Jesus gives a wonderful example of this. I mean, wonderful for his rhetorical purposes. He says, the Torah says, you should honor your father and mother, and that one who does not honor father and mother must die. Now, honor, we have to understand, means, in the way that Chazal, in the way that the rabbis understand, it means to feed them, to take care of them, to when they are old, that they should walk, supported by the child. So to honor doesn't mean to say, I honor it means to concretely and physically honor. And likalel, which is the opposite of to honor, because to honor is lichabed, to make them heavy. So likalel is to make them light, is to make light. Lizalzel, we would say in modern Hebrew, right? To dishonor, which would mean not to feed and not to care for, not to support materially one's parents. And this, the Torah tells us, if we do this, then mot yumat, then we will die. But the Pharisees say, actually we don't know this to be a fact, but at least according to this report, the Pharisees say that if one takes a vow, konam alai masha yochal abba ve'ima, masha yochlu abba ve'ima, that whatever my parents will eat from me is a korban, is like a sacrifice, and therefore forbidden, that then I don't have to, not only do I not have to feed my parents, but I may not, because I took a vow not to. So Jesus uses this as an example. He says, look, here the Pharisees are saying, we have this tradition that if somebody says this formula, kona malay, that it is like a sacrifice, then he doesn't have to and may not fulfill the words of the Torah. So they are putting their human tradition, their Masorat Avot, their tradition of the fathers, in place of Moshe. Instead of Moshe, they are setting aside Moshe for their own tradition, which is exactly what Jesus is complaining about here. So what we have here is a controversy between two different ideas about the Torah. A Pharisaic idea and a different idea. And in a moment I'll explain what the basis of the difference is. So the Pharisees have the idea that there is, in addition to the written Torah, there is also an oral tradition. And Jesus, as a representative of non-Pharisaic Jews, of Jews from the Galilee, from the Galil, who have ancient traditions of their own and disagree with the Pharisees, he sees what the Pharisees are doing as actually attacking the Torah. And he is defending the Torah from the Pharisees. So, according to the interpretations that are existing till now, it is impossible to make sense of why Jesus went off on this story about parents and curses and vows. And in fact, most Christian scholars read that little story here as an interpolation, as something that was put in later on and doesn't really belong in the text. So now let's look at verse 14 together. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. There is the absent verse 16, the great phantom verse. We could call it the phantom of the gospel. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. Where is there a parable? We know what a parable is. Jesus says something like that, let those who have ears hear and understand. And then he tells a story. But here there's no parable. And this is the moment, according to the interpreters, that Kashrut ends. Where's the parable? But let's put back verse 16 now. The missing verse 16 says, if any man has ears to hear, let him hear. This is, of course, the formula that Jesus says before, as I hinted before he tells a parable. Then verse 15 must be a parable. The literal sense is exactly what it says in the book of Leviticus and in the book of Deuteronomy. A person does not become impure by putting things into the body, but by things that come out from the body. And then he says, let him who has ears to hear, hear, which means this is a parable and it has a figurative meaning. And Jesus then says to the disciples, do you still not understand the parable? And then he explains, things that go into the body don't make us impure, but only things that come out to teach us something. Namely, to teach us the moral and religious point that when we think evil thoughts, or when we do evil things, when we speak evil things, that we are behaving in the wrong way. But this moral can only be understood if the halakha is kept, if the rules are kept strictly as they are in the Torah. And the Pharisees, by insisting on washing hands, that is to purify the hands, are implying that it would be possible to eat with impure hands, to make the food impure, and then to make the body impure. And if they do that, if they imply that, then they are missing the literal sense of the Torah, and by missing the literal sense, by messing up the literal sense, then they completely lose the moral meaning as well. But the Gentile church, as it developed, let's say by the middle of the 2nd or the 3rd century, when there were more ta'ethni, more Gentiles than Jews in the church, they were desperate to find where Jesus says that it's all right for them to eat the kind of food that they always eat. Because it didn't work for them in antiquity to say, okay, Paul said we can eat anything, but Jesus not. So for them it became necessary to read verse 15 when Jesus says there's nothing that goes into the body which makes impure, that he is setting aside the Torah and not that he is supporting the Torah. But then, of course, let him who has ears to hear, hear doesn't make any sense because there's no parable, there's no literal and figurative meaning. And that explains why verse 16 is no longer either in Greek or English or Russian New Testaments.